Good morning. I apologize for being late. For some reason, my desktop will no longer do Facebook Live videos. So I had to scramble for a second device. So sorry, let's take a breath. I'm a little late, so I hope everyone who's joining me will let me know who you are, who's here. And deep breath. Enjoy the craziness of dealing with technology full time, and I'll deal with the desktop device when we're done with our story time. So welcome. I'm Marcy Bowden from Valley Unitarian Universalist Congregation, and this is our weekly Monday morning story time. We are finishing up the principles. Today is the 7th principle, so I've got my principle sticks here, looking for the violet one. Tells me number 7. Remember, these were super easy to make. I just took 7 pieces of cardboard. You can use any kind of stick that you can write on. I added the color of the rainbow that corresponds to the principle, wrote the number on the front, and on the back I wrote a little cheat so it was easy to remember what the principles are. You may also notice I have behind me my signs color-coded with all the principles too. This blue is starting to look gray, isn't it? A little sun damage. So, 7th principle, we care for the planet Earth. And that means the planet, the plants, the people, the animals, all the creatures, everything that we can do to take care of our environment and our planet. So I have a lot of books on the 7th principle. It's a really easy one to find books about. Some of my favorites, this one, What a Wonderful World. This was based on the song that we know by Louis Armstrong, though he did not write it. It was written by Bob Thiele and George David Weiss. So this is just a cute kid's storybook with the lyrics of the song. Something educational, Ready, Set, Go Organic. Fun, these cows are teaching us how to make more organic choices. As always, I will upload a link for you that has a huge list of books for the 7th principle. But one that I want to share with you today is Make Way for Ducklings. This is by Robert McCloskey. You may know this name, Blueberries for Sal, a couple of others that you may know. This was written in 1941, and maybe I knew it because my parents knew it, but I grew up in New England, and this takes place in Boston. So that could be why I know it, and fewer people out here in the West know this story. But when we take the coming of age youth to Boston, because the history of not only American history, but Unitarian history and Universalist history, both separately, congregate in Boston. It's a fabulous place. And we stay right near where this duckling story takes place. And we can go to the park, we can see their statue. So I had to make sure that the coming of age youth know this story, because not only is it dear to me, but it's where we are. So it's a longish story. And the drawings are all done in this brown ink, almost pencil type drawing. But I want to share it with you because it's a beautiful story of how we take care of each other and the creatures in our world. So, Make Way for Ducklings. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it, the very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So down they flapped. The next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond. They didn't find much. Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people. There was a man sitting on its back. Good morning, quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts in the water. So the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed down to the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But, "Look out," squawked Mrs. Mallard all a dither. "You'll get run over." When she got her breath, she added, "This is no place for babies. With all those horrid things rushing about, we'll have to look somewhere else." Look what the horrid thing was. A kid on a bike, huh? So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place. They looked in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mrs. Mallard. "That island looks like a nice, quiet place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks like just the right place to hatch the ducklings." So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. All their old wing feathers started dropping out. They would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course, they could swim. And one day they swam over to the park on the riverbank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that, the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water, or to have lunch, or to count the eggs and make sure that they were all there. One day, the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then came Cack, and then Lack, then Mack, and Knack, and Whack, and Pack, and Quack. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. "I'll meet you in a week in the public garden." He quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. She taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." And before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack fell into line, just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way to the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to a highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross. Honk, honk went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 quack went Jack, Knack, Lack, Mack, Cack, Whack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on, quack, quack, quacking. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other the way policemen do for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. Mrs. Mallard and the Ducklings were safe on the other side on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send the police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned onto Charles Street, with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Whack, Pack, and Quack all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" The man who swept the street said, "Well, now, ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the Ducklings could march across the street. See them there? Right into the public gardens. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman. The policeman waved and smiled goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The Ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they follow the swan boats and eat the peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. I like that story. Do you? So, make way for Ducklings. Hi everybody, glad you're here. Stephen, nice to see you again. So we're working on the 7th principle today, all about our planet and all of our animals that we're going to take care of and our environment. And I have a story to tell you. It's based on the book Laundress Roses. And I've got just some little goodies to set up the story. But of course, after my technology breakdown, I may have to tilt my camera a little bit so you can see what's going on here. Maybe I can scoot it backwards. Can't get anything to stand up either. Well, this is a challenging day, isn't it? Let's see. That doesn't help, does it? I may have to hold it. Okay. So here's our yaw. Oh, sorry, am I making you dizzy? All right. Sorry, let me pause this and figure out how I can make this so you can see it without making everybody dizzy. Yeah, you can see that a bit, huh? Let me see if I can raise this up a smidge. Sorry, as I said earlier, my desktop will no longer allow me to do Facebook videos. I have to change my browser. That came as a negative, unexpected surprise today. So, all right, here we are with Wanda's Roses. So the story starts with Wanda. And in the neighborhood she lives in, there's an area that's not well taken care of, a lot that has a lot of garbage dumped on it, and Wanda walks by it every day on her way to school. And she happened to notice today that there was this bush here, and it looked like it had thorns, but it really wasn't doing very well. But Wanda loved beautiful things, and she just felt her heart beat faster. And she thought, I bet that's a rose bush. I bet I can bring it back to life and it'll be beautiful. Now, rose bushes didn't really belong to Wanda, because this lot didn't belong to her, but she wanted to take care of it. So she decided to make it her own, and all during school she thought about this rose bush. She drew art and pictures of what it would look like when it was in bloom. And during the library time, she borrowed books on arranging flowers. During science, she asked so many questions about how to take care of roses that finally her teacher had to tell her, get back to the lesson, which is electricity today. So Wanda was thinking all about it, and on her way home, she stopped to check out the rose bush again. It was bare and thorny. Maybe it just needs some sunlight, she thought. So she put down her school bag and she thought she should drag away some of this trash. Let's start with this big wheel. Get it out of the way. She thought that the plant needed some more sunlight. Mrs. Turner, who was on her way to the store, stopped by. There's Mrs. Turner. Are you cleaning up the neighborhood, Wanda? She asked. What a nice project for you. Oh, I'm not just cleaning, said Wanda. I'm going to help take care of my rose bush. It needs more sun so that it can bloom. A rose bush? Where is there a rose bush? So Wanda showed her this thorny bush here. And Mrs. Turner said, Wanda, I'm not sure that's a rose bush. Oh, sure it is, said Wanda. I've seen rose bushes in books. And this is what they look like before they bloom. You just wait. In a few weeks, it will be full of roses. Well, said Mrs. Turner, she's kind of shaking her head. Good luck with it. And she walked away. And she thought to herself, if that's a rose bush, then I'm the Queen of England. The next day after school, Wanda hurried over to her rose bush. It was still bare and thorny. Maybe it needs more air, she thought. So she put down her school bag and she decided to drag some more of the trash away. She took it to the curb for curbside pickup. Once I get this trash out of the way, nothing will block the air and my rose bush will bloom, thought Wanda. Mr. Claudel was on his way home from work, and he saw Wanda trying to drag some pretty heavy trash, and so he offered to help. Because you're cleaning up the neighborhood, Wanda, that's great, I can help. Well, not just cleaning, Mr. Claudel, said Wanda. I'm getting rid of the trash so my rose bush can breathe. A rose bush growing here, said Mr. Claudel. So she showed him the rose bush. I don't know much about gardening, Wanda, said Mr. Claudel, but I don't think that's a rose bush. Sure it is, said Wanda. And in a few weeks, this lot is going to be filled with the sweetest smelling roses that you ever saw. She thanked him for his help, and he went home and she kept dragging trash out of the way. Mr. Claudel thought, if that's a rose bush, then I'm the King of France. Nobody seems to believe Wanda, do they? Every day after school that week and the whole next week, Wanda worked on cleaning up the trash in that area, emptying the lot. Mrs. Giamatti, who lived next door, was so impressed with Wanda doing all this cleaning, she brought her some trash bags and helped her do with the cleanup. Just cleaning getting rid of some of this trash so that my rose bush has enough sun and air to bloom, said Wanda. Mrs. Giamatti said, oh, where's the rose bush? So Wanda showed it to her. And again, what do you think? Mrs. Giamatti said, I'm not sure that's a rose bush, Wanda. Oh, it is, said Wanda. In a few weeks, this lot's going to be filled with the most beautiful roses you ever saw. Well, that sure would be nice, said Mrs. Giamatti. I just don't want you to be disappointed if it doesn't bloom. Don't worry, I won't be disappointed, said Wanda. Mrs. Giamatti sighed. This is not a rose bush, and it will never be one, she thought. But she went home. The next week, the rose bush still wasn't blooming. So Wanda talked to her school librarian, Mrs. Jones. I need some books about how to get roses to bloom, said Mrs. Jones. Oh, do you have a rose bush, said Mrs. Jones. Yes, but it doesn't have any flowers yet. I know it's getting enough sun, and I know it's getting enough fresh air. Does it have water? Mrs. Jones asked. Water, said Wanda. Of course, that will make it bloom. So that afternoon, she hurried to the rose bush. Nope, still bare, no blooms. So she looked around at the dry ground and she thought to herself, I know what'll help you, little bush. I'll get you some water and then you'll be able to grow some roses. So Wanda went across the street to Mr. Sanchez's butcher. Mr. Sanchez, would you give me some water for my rose bush? Rose bush? Is that what I see you taking care of and talking to every day out there? Are you sure it's a rose bush? Mr. Sanchez asked. Yes, but it can't bloom yet because it needs water. Oh, well, of course. I can give you water, and he gave her a plastic bucket. I do hope it is a rose bush, Wanda, he said, looking at her doubtfully. You'll see, Wanda told him. In a few weeks, that lot will be full of roses. So Wanda carried her water to her rose bush. Mr. Sanchez muttered to himself, in a few weeks, that thorn bush will still be a thorn bush. Every day, Wanda ran to her lot. She was cleaning up the trash. She was watering the rose bush. But still, it was bare. There were no roses. Mrs. Turner used to take a peek to see if any roses were happening. Nothing. Mr. Claudel, on his way home from work sometimes, would stop to see. No roses. Mrs. Giamatti sometimes saw Wanda in the lot and hollered down to her, asked her, are there any roses yet? Wanda said no. She went to the library. Mrs. Jones said, hey, how are your rose bushes doing? Every day, Wanda went to the butcher shop, got more water. Mr. Sanchez asked too, any roses yet? No, but she kept watering, kept clearing away the trash to make sure that there was plenty of sunlight and air. Pretty soon the lot looked pretty cleaned up, but the rose bush still looked like a thorn bush. And then one day, Wanda had an idea. She thought, if my rose bush won't give me roses, I'll have to give roses to my rose bush. And when she saw Mrs. Turner, Mr. Claudel, Mrs. Giamatti, Miss Jones, and Mr. Sanchez, she gave them each an invitation to come to a party at the spare lot, which was all cleaned up now. She said, come for tea and muffins in Wanda's rose garden on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. Oh dear, said Mrs. Turner, is she still expecting to get roses from that bush? Oh no, said Mr. Claudel, she's worked so hard. Oh my, said Mrs. Giamatti, she'll be so disappointed. Darn, said Mr. Sanchez, there must be something I can do. Good, said Mrs. Jones, who'd only heard about the bush from Wanda and didn't know what it looked like. I'll bring my special tea to her party. So the next morning at 9, everyone was surprised to see Wanda's rose bush covered with paper roses. She had made them herself. But more surprising yet, Mrs. Turner showed up carrying roses. Mr. Sanchez came carrying roses. Oops. Mr. Claudel brought a rose plant. Mrs. Giamatti brought a rose plant. And Miss Jones brought her special tea. After they had eaten their muffins and drank their tea, they all got busy planting all of these rose bushes that all these friends had brought. Mr. Claudel and Mrs. Turner took turns digging the holes. Mrs. Giamatti held the bushes in place while Wanda and Miss Jones filled in around the roots with soil. And Mr. Sanchez brought water from his shop and watered them all thoroughly. When the work was finished, Mr. Claudel said, Wanda, this is going to be a rose garden fit for a king. Or a queen, said Mrs. Turner. Wanda and the others smiled. And later that summer, the whole lot was filled with the biggest, most beautiful, sweet-smelling roses that anyone had ever seen, just as Wanda had said it would. Wanda's Roses. So this was the last of our 7 principal stories. We'll have to think of what our next project's going to start. I'm looking at our 6 Unitarian Universalist sources. So let's see what books I can come up with that. See you on Monday morning at 10:30. Bye everybody, have a great day.